What's up, guys? Ryan here, also known as Max Afterburner, former F-15E combat fighter pilot, F-16 Thunderbird pilot, and I've flown airliners for years as well. Today we are breaking down one of the most significant military operations in decades. U.S. bunker buster bombs just obliterated Iran's nuclear program, at least that's the headline, and I want to walk you through exactly what happened, what these weapons actually do, and then I'll give you my honest professional take at the end, including where the story stands right now, because there's more to this than just one night of bombs falling. Before we dive in, I want to say this video is built entirely on verified reporting from the Pentagon, the Department of Defense briefings, and confirmed statements from military leadership. Where there's still debate or uncertainty, I'm going to tell you clearly that it's uncertain. I'm not going to feed you rumors dressed up as facts. This is a serious topic involving nuclear infrastructure and lives on the ground, so I want to handle it with the same respect I'd want if I was the one flying the mission. So let's set the scene. On June 21st, 2025, the United States launched Operation Midnight Hammer, a strike against three of Iran's most critical nuclear facilities, Fordow, Natanz, and Isfahan. This came in the middle of what's now called the 12-Day War, which kicked off on June 13th when Israel launched surprise strikes on Iranian nuclear and military targets under Operation Rising Lion. Israel had hit hard, but there was one target Israel physically could not crack: Fordow. Fordow is buried somewhere between 80 and 90 meters underground, dug into a mountain about 29 kilometers north of the Iranian city of Qom. We're talking a facility that houses roughly 3,000 centrifuges, spread across cascades of older IR-1 machines and newer, more efficient IR-6 machines. This site was specifically built to survive an airstrike. It's under hundreds of feet of rock, and until this operation, only one country on the planet had a weapon that could physically punch through that kind of depth and still detonate with enough force to matter. That country is the United States, and that weapon is the GBU-57A/B, better known as the Massive Ordnance Penetrator, or MOP. Let me put this bomb in perspective for you, because the numbers are wild. The MOP is about 20 feet long. It weighs 30,000 pounds. And it's designed to punch through more than 200 feet of earth and reinforced concrete before it detonates. This is not a bomb that blows up on impact. It's a bomb that's built to survive the impact, keep driving downward through rock and structure using pure kinetic energy and a hardened steel casing, and then detonate once it's deep inside the target. Think of it like a battering ram with an explosive charge on the back end. The physics behind that are honestly incredible when you think about the engineering tolerances required. You need a casing that can survive slamming through solid rock at hundreds of miles an hour without prematurely detonating or breaking apart, and a fuse system precise enough to know exactly when it's reached the right depth to go off. Here's something that a lot of people don't realize. This was the first time the MOP had ever been used in an actual combat operation. It had been tested extensively, but it had never been dropped on a real target in a real war before Operation Midnight Hammer. So not only was this a massive strategic operation, it was also the operational debut of America's most powerful non-nuclear bomb. And there's only one aircraft on the planet that can carry this thing, the B-2 Spirit stealth bomber. You can't sling this weapon under an F-15 or an F-16. It has to be carried internally in the weapons bay of a B-2, which is one of the reasons this operation is such a big deal from a pure air power perspective. The B-2 is a flying wing design, no vertical tail, incredibly low radar cross-section, and it's one of the most expensive and rare aircraft in the world. There are only a handful of them in the entire Air Force inventory. Sending 7 of them on a single mission deep into contested airspace is an enormous commitment of a scarce and precious asset. So let's talk about how the mission actually unfolded, because this is where it gets fascinating from a tactics and planning perspective. 7 B-2 Spirit bombers took off from Whiteman Air Force Base in Missouri. That's in the middle of the continental United States, nowhere near the Middle East. And they flew east continuously for about 18 hours straight, refueling multiple times in the air along the way. 18 hours in a jet is an absolutely brutal mission profile for the crews. 2 pilots per aircraft, cramped in that cockpit the entire time, managing systems, managing fuel, managing fatigue, all while maintaining strict radio discipline because the entire success of this mission depended on nobody knowing they were coming. And here's the piece that I think is genuinely one of the more clever elements of this whole operation. At the same time the main strike package was heading east toward Iran, a separate group of B-2 bombers flew west, out over the Pacific, as a decoy. That deception effort was reportedly known to only a very small number of planners in Washington and at U.S. Central Command. Think about that for a second. Even people inside the Pentagon who would normally be looped in on a mission like this may not have known the real target package was heading the other direction. That's the level of operational security we're talking about. When those westbound B-2s were spotted by open source trackers and satellite watchers online, the entire internet assumed that was the strike package. It wasn't. It was a deliberate piece of misdirection, and it worked. While the B-2s were inbound, a U.S. Navy submarine, an Ohio-class guided missile sub, launched more than 24 Tomahawk land attack missiles at the Isfahan Nuclear Technology Center. Isfahan is a different kind of target than Fordow. It's not buried nearly as deep, so it didn't require the penetrating power of the MOP. Tomahawks are cruise missiles. They fly low, they're subsonic, but they're precise, and they're launched from a platform that's already hidden underwater, hundreds of miles from the target, completely outside the reach of Iranian air defenses. The submarine itself never has to enter Iranian territorial waters or expose itself to any real risk. It can sit well outside the range of coastal defenses and still put a guided missile precisely on a building hundreds of miles inland. That's part of why the Navy's submarine-launched cruise missile capability gets used so often in these kinds of operations. It lets you strike a target without ever putting a crewed platform anywhere near the actual threat envelope, which is a very different risk calculation than sending manned bombers directly overhead of a target. Because of the difference in flight time and distance, those Tomahawks were actually fired before the B-2s dropped their bombs, but they didn't arrive on target at Isfahan until shortly after the bombing at Fordow and Natanz had already happened. Now let's talk about the fighter escort piece of this, because this is something I can speak to directly from my own background flying fighters. You do not send a strike package that deep into enemy airspace without air superiority assets clearing the way first. According to the Pentagon, and confirmed by President Trump, 4th and 5th generation fighters, reportedly F-35s and F-22s, entered Iranian airspace ahead of the B-2s specifically to draw out any surface-to-air missile response and to suppress any air defense systems that lit up. This is a classic strike package tactic. You put your most survivable, hardest to detect assets forward to absorb the initial risk and confirm the airspace is safe, or at least manageable, before your high-value bombers commit to the target area. Here's the important part. According to General Dan Kane, chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff, no shots were fired at the incoming aircraft. Iranian fighters did not scramble. Iranian surface-to-air missile systems reportedly did not even detect the package. Now, part of that is because Israel had already spent over a week grinding down Iranian air defense infrastructure during Operation Rising Lion, so by the time the American package arrived, a lot of the radar and missile systems that would normally challenge an incursion like this were already degraded or destroyed. Still, flying 7 irreplaceable stealth bombers that deep into hostile territory with 0 shots fired at them is either an extraordinary tactical success, or it's a sign of just how much damage had already been done to Iran's air defense network before the Americans even showed up. Realistically, it's both. At around 6:40 p.m. Eastern Time, which was about 2:10 in the morning local time in Iran, the lead B-2 dropped the first 2 MOPs on Fordow. Over the following 25 minutes or so, the bombers methodically worked through their target list. In total, 12 of the 14 MOPs were dropped on Fordow, and 2 were dropped on Natanz. From a tactics perspective, dropping bombs sequentially on the same aim points, specifically targeting ventilation and exhaust shafts at Fordow, is a technique used to maximize penetration depth. You're essentially using the crater and structural damage from the first bomb to help subsequent bombs punch even deeper into the same access point, rather than just cratering the surface in multiple different spots. I want you to sit with that detail for a second, because it tells you something about how long this target had been studied. General Kane mentioned in briefings that officers from the Defense Threat Reduction Agency had been studying Fordow specifically for around 15 years, tracking its ventilation shafts, its exhaust systems, its electrical infrastructure, basically every piece of equipment going in and out of that facility since roughly 2009. That is not a target list that gets built overnight. That's over a decade of intelligence work, engineering analysis, and weapons development specifically pointed at one mountain in Iran. In total, more than 125 U.S. aircraft supported this mission when you include the bombers, the fighter escorts, the tankers for aerial refueling, and surveillance and electronic warfare aircraft. Approximately 75 precision-guided weapons were employed across the entire operation. After the bombs and missiles hit their targets, the strike package exited Iranian airspace and began the long flight home. All 13 B-2s involved, including the decoy aircraft, were expected back at Whiteman Air Force Base by the following afternoon. Let's talk logistics for a second, because I think that people underestimate just how much work goes into keeping 7 irreplaceable bombers fueled for an 18-hour one-way transit, followed by a return leg of similar length. You don't just take off with full tanks and go. Aerial refueling on a mission like this happens multiple times, with tanker aircraft like the KC-135 Stratotanker and the newer KC-46A Pegasus meeting the bombers at pre-planned points along the route, matching speed and altitude and transferring thousands of pounds of fuel through a boom while both aircraft are flying in close formation at altitude. That's a demanding, precise maneuver even in daylight over friendly airspace during a training flight. Doing it repeatedly during an actual combat mission at night, while trying to maintain radio silence and operational security, adds an entirely different layer of difficulty. Every one of those refueling tracks had to be planned, timed, and coordinated across multiple time zones without a single public indication that anything unusual was happening. I also want to explain why the B-2 specifically was the only option here, because the aircraft itself is a story worth understanding. The B-2 Spirit is a flying wing design, meaning it has no traditional fuselage or tail section the way a normal aircraft does. That shape isn't just for looks. It dramatically reduces the aircraft's radar cross-section, meaning it reflects far less radar energy back to an enemy sensor compared to a conventional airframe. Combine that shape with radar-absorbing composite materials in the skin of the aircraft, and you get a bomber that can penetrate deep into contested airspace with a much lower probability of detection than almost anything else in the world. The trade-off is that there are very few of these aircraft in existence. They are enormously expensive to maintain, and every single sortie represents a significant portion of the entire fleet's total combat capability. Committing 7 of them to a single mission, out of a total fleet that numbers in the low 20s, is not a decision made lightly. Now, onto the weapon itself, because I think the development history of the Massive Ordnance Penetrator deserves more attention than it usually gets. This bomb wasn't rushed into existence for this one mission. It was developed over roughly 2 decades specifically with hardened, deeply buried targets like Fordow in mind. Engineers had to solve a problem that sounds simple but is incredibly difficult in practice. How do you build a bomb casing that can survive slamming through solid rock and reinforced concrete at extremely high speed without the casing cracking, without the fuse triggering too early, and without the explosive charge inside detonating from the sheer force of impact before it's supposed to? That required specialized steel alloys, extensive computer modeling, and reportedly hundreds of individual tests before the weapon was ever certified for real-world use. And even after all of that engineering, this strike marked the very first time it had ever been used in an actual armed conflict rather than a test range. Now let's talk about the reaction back home, because that's part of the full story too, and I think it's important context for understanding how significant this operation was viewed to be. Congressional Republicans largely supported the strike. Many Democrats and some Republicans raised concerns, not necessarily about whether the mission was executed well, but about the constitutional question of the president ordering a strike like this without a formal declaration of war or extended congressional consultation beforehand. Congressional leadership was reportedly notified only once the aircraft were already clear of danger, which is a detail that fueled a lot of that debate. Internationally, the reaction was mixed as well. Some allied nations welcomed the strike as a necessary step to prevent a hostile regime from crossing the nuclear threshold. Others expressed concern about the precedent of a unilateral strike on sovereign territory and the risk of the conflict spiraling into something larger across the region. Iran, for its part, called the strikes a violation of international law and vowed a response. That response came fairly quickly. Iran launched an attack against a U.S. base in Qatar in the immediate aftermath, though a ceasefire between Iran and Israel was announced shortly after, effectively closing out the active phase of what's now referred to as the 12-Day War. Iran also formally suspended its cooperation with the International Atomic Energy Agency not long after that, which is a significant development on its own because it means the world's primary nuclear watchdog organization lost its ability to independently verify conditions inside these facilities right at the moment when everyone most wanted that verification. So now let's get into the part that matters most, which is what this actually did to Iran's nuclear program. And here's where I want to be very careful, because this is where a lot of channels start making things up or picking a side to get views. I'm going to give you the full picture, including the disagreement, because that's the honest answer. Secretary of Defense Pete Hegseth called the strikes an incredible and overwhelming success. President Trump initially said Iran's nuclear enrichment facilities had been completely and totally obliterated. Chairman Kane, in his briefings, was more measured, saying that initial battle damage assessments indicated the precision munitions struck where they were intended to strike and had the desired effect, but that a full assessment would take time. Satellite imagery from Maxar Technologies afterward showed real physical evidence of the strike. At Natanz, there was an approximately 5-meter diameter hole visible directly over part of the underground complex. At Isfahan, there was extensive new building damage visible across the facility from the Tomahawk strikes. At Fordow, aerial imagery showed several large craters and a mountainside blanketed in ash and dirt from the MOP impacts. But here's where it gets complicated. A preliminary classified assessment from the Defense Intelligence Agency, which leaked to the press, suggested the strikes had only set Iran's nuclear program back by a matter of months, not permanently destroyed it. The White House pushed back hard on that report, calling it flat out wrong. Separately, the Pentagon's own public assessment eventually settled on a timeline of the program being set back somewhere between 1 and 2 years. So even among official U.S. sources, there was a real spread between total obliteration on one end and a matter of months on the other, before landing on that 1 to 2 year estimate. Part of the reason for that uncertainty is something that I think doesn't get talked about enough. Iran reportedly had roughly 400 kilograms of uranium, enriched to 60% purity before the strikes, which is a level far beyond what's needed for civilian power generation, and just a technical step below weapons grade. That stockpile, according to multiple intelligence assessments, may have already been moved out of these facilities in the days before the attack. You can destroy a building. You can destroy centrifuges. It is much, much harder to destroy material that's already been relocated somewhere you don't know about. International Atomic Energy Agency inspectors have not had access to Iran's nuclear sites since the strikes, so a lot of what we know since then has come from satellite imagery and signals intelligence rather than boots-on-the-ground verification, which naturally limits how confident anyone can be about the current state of that material. I want to spend a little more time on this uranium stockpile question, because I think it's the single most important detail in this entire story, more important, honestly, than the bombs themselves. Before the strikes, the IAEA had confirmed Iran possessed around 440 kilograms of uranium enriched to 60% purity. To put that in perspective, weapons-grade material is generally considered to be enriched to around 90%. So 60% is a significant technical step, closer to weapons capability than typical civilian reactor fuel, which usually sits in the low single digits. Some assessments put Iran's broader stockpile, including material enriched to lower levels, at over 9,000 kilograms total. Experts have said that 440 kilograms of 60% material, if further enriched, would be sufficient for somewhere in the range of 9 to 10 nuclear devices. That's the material everyone was trying to eliminate, or at least neutralize with this strike. And it's also the piece that satellite photos of craters and collapsed tunnel entrances simply cannot confirm one way or another. You can see a hole in a mountain from space. You cannot see whether the material that used to be inside that mountain was quietly trucked out beforehand. It's also worth understanding just how rare and difficult a target Fordow really is in the broader history of hardened target strikes. This wasn't the first time a nation has tried to design a bunker deep enough and hardened enough to survive conventional air power, but Fordow represented one of the most extreme examples of that design philosophy ever built, for a nuclear program specifically. Most hardened military bunkers are built to survive artillery or standard guided bombs. Fordow was built from the outset with the specific knowledge that the United States possessed bunker penetrating technology, and it was positioned deep enough into a mountain that, for years, many analysts genuinely doubted any conventional weapon could reach it at all. That's part of why the successful employment of the MOP here is being studied so closely by militaries and defense analysts around the world, well beyond just the Iran situation. It's a real-world proof of concept for a weapons category that had only existed on paper and test ranges until this mission. I also want to mention, because staying current on this matters, that this is not where the story ended in 2025. Iran did retaliate at the time, launching an attack against a U.S. base in Qatar, after which a ceasefire between Iran and Israel was announced. Iran also suspended its cooperation with the IAEA shortly after. And in the time since, satellite imagery has shown continued construction activity at other suspected nuclear-related sites in Iran, along with hardened tunnel entrances designed specifically to resist future airstrikes. Tensions between the U.S. and Iran escalated again in early 2026, ultimately leading to another separate military campaign. That is a whole story of its own, and I'm not going to blend the two operations together here, because I want this video to stay focused and accurate on what actually happened during Midnight Hammer specifically. Now let me give you my honest opinion as a pilot who has flown combat missions, though never anything at this scale or with this kind of weapon. From a pure execution standpoint, this was an extremely well-run operation. An 18-hour, single-leg strike mission with multiple aerial refuelings, a legitimate decoy package flying the opposite direction, and a fighter escort clearing the path ahead, all while maintaining enough secrecy that even senior people in Washington reportedly didn't know the real target package was heading toward Iran. That is, about as close to a textbook deep strike mission as you're going to see. The fact that all 7 bombers made it in, dropped their weapons, and made it out without a single shot being fired at them speaks to both the skill of the crews and the effectiveness of the preceding Israeli campaign against Iranian air defenses. Where I'd push back on some of the public messaging is the word obliterated. As a pilot, I know the difference between hitting a target precisely and knowing with certainty what that target actually contained at the moment of impact. The weapons reportedly struck exactly where they were aimed. That part, I don't doubt, given the years of study that clearly went into targeting those ventilation shafts. But whether the enriched uranium stockpile was still inside those buildings when the bombs went off is a completely separate question from whether the bombs hit their mark. And that's the piece that even the Pentagon's own initial assessments couldn't fully answer. I think it's fair to call this operation a resounding tactical and technical success. I think it's premature, based on the public information available, to call it a permanent strategic solution. And that's not me second-guessing the crews who flew it. Those air crews did their job flawlessly by every account we have. It's a comment on the broader challenge of trying to eliminate a nuclear program with airstrikes alone, when the most dangerous part of that program is material you can move, hide, and relocate long before the bombs ever arrive. I also want to take a second to talk about just how significant it is that the United States is the only country that currently possesses both the Massive Ordnance Penetrator and the B-2 Spirit needed to deliver it. Israel, despite having an incredibly capable and combat-proven air force, physically could not have executed the Fordow portion of this strike on their own because they don't have an aircraft that can carry a 30,000-pound bomb, and they don't have the bomb itself. That's part of why this became a joint effort rather than something Israel could finish alone during its own campaign. It's a pretty stark reminder of how a handful of very specific, very expensive weapon systems can completely change the strategic calculus for an entire region. I think about this from a pilot's perspective a lot, the idea that an entire strategic decision at the highest levels of government can hinge on the simple fact that only one country in the world owns both the airframe and the munition needed to physically reach a target. That's not a coincidence. That's the result of decades of investment in a very narrow, very expensive capability that most people never think about until the one moment it actually gets used. The B-2 program has existed since the late 1980s. The MOP has been in development in some form for roughly 20 years. Neither of those programs was built with Fordow specifically in mind when they started, but by the time this mission happened, they were the only tools on the planet capable of doing the job. That's the kind of long-horizon defense planning that doesn't make headlines for decades. Right up until the night, it becomes the entire story. I also think it's worth acknowledging how differently this could have gone. If Israeli strikes hadn't already degraded Iranian air defenses over the preceding week, this mission profile looks completely different. You're potentially looking at a much higher risk penetration into airspace, still actively defended by surface-to-air missile systems and interceptor aircraft. The fact that this strike happened with 0 shots fired at the package is, in my opinion, as much a product of the timing and sequencing of the broader campaign as it is a product of stealth technology alone. Stealth buys you a reduced probability of detection. It doesn't make you invisible. Layering that reduced signature on top of an air defense network that had already been substantially degraded is what got these bombers in and out clean. Take away that degraded air defense picture, and even a B-2 strike package becomes a meaningfully riskier proposition. One more thing I want to flag, purely from a professional standpoint. Whenever I see phrases like completely and totally obliterated used in the same breath as ongoing battle damage assessment, my instinct, as someone who's flown combat missions, is to wait for the follow-up reporting before drawing a final conclusion. That's not a knock on anyone. In the immediate aftermath of a mission like this, you genuinely don't have full visibility into every variable yet. Bomb damage assessment takes time, and in this case it also required overhead imagery, human intelligence, and technical analysis that simply couldn't all be gathered and verified within the first 24 to 48 hours. I'd rather give you the honest picture that early public statements and the more measured internal assessments didn't perfectly line up than pretend there was total unanimous agreement on the outcome from day one. That gap between the public messaging and the more cautious internal assessments is itself part of the story, and I think it's more useful to you as a viewer than a headline that just tells you it's over. At the end of the day, we're talking about a mission that took years of intelligence work, an enormous logistical effort, cutting-edge and genuinely one-of-a-kind weapons technology, and incredibly skilled air crews executing a nearly day-long combat mission with precision. Whatever your opinion on the broader politics of striking Iran, and I know that's a topic people feel very strongly about on both sides, the execution of Operation Midnight Hammer itself, purely from a military operations and air power standpoint, was about as clean and well-coordinated as these things get. The bigger and more honest question, the one that intelligence agencies are still working through even now, is what it actually accomplished long-term. And that's a question that satellite photos alone can't fully answer. One last thing before I wrap this up. I think it's important to separate two very different questions that often get blended together in coverage like this. The first question is, did the United States military execute this specific mission well? Based on everything I've walked you through, the timing, the deception package, the escort tactics, the refueling logistics, the precision of the weapons impacts, the answer to that question is clearly yes. The second question is, did this mission permanently end Iran's nuclear ambitions? That's a completely different question, It depends on things no pilot or bomb can fully control, like where a stockpile of material physically ends up before the bombs ever drop, and what a government decides to do next politically. Hold both truths at once, right alongside each other. That's the most accurate way to understand what this operation did and didn't accomplish. I want to give a quick shout out to my dad, who spent time going over some of these technical details with me before I put this video together. So Dad, thank you for that as always. If you found this breakdown valuable, I've got 2 things I genuinely appreciate. First, subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications, because I'm going to keep covering how this story develops as more information becomes declassified or confirmed, and I don't want you to miss the follow-up. Second, drop a comment below and let me know specifically what part of this mission profile you want me to dig deeper into next, whether that's the B-2's radar cross-section and stealth characteristics, the physics behind how the MOP actually penetrates rock and concrete, or the aerial refueling logistics behind an 18-hour combat sortie. I read every comment, and it genuinely shapes what I cover next. This is Ryan, also known as Max Afterburner, also known as the fighter pilot, next door, signing off. Stay safe out there, and I'll see you in the next one.